Aloha, and thank you, Lehua, for the opportunity. Aloha, everyone. My name is Claudine Allen. I'm a lead Native Hawaiian program specialist in the HUD Honolulu office. I work in HUD's Office of Native American Programs, and I work very closely with Lehua and the NHHBG staff at the Department of Hawaiian Homelands to support them in their implementation of the NHHBG program, also known as the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant. Today's training session is part of a series of trainings that we're recording with regards to the NHHBG or Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program, and to learn more about the program requirements that are applicable to this program. So today's session is a follow-up on the general overview session that we did back in March. And following that overview session, we're doing the subsequent trainings to do a deeper dive into some of the different program requirements. So today, we'll be focusing in on the useful life affordability restrictions and binding commitments applicable to the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant Program. I wanted to turn my camera on for introduction purposes, but I'm going to turn my camera off during the presentation. And then once the presentation is done, I'll turn my camera back on for the question and answer session. So again, mahalo for joining us today. Oops, excuse me. So the purpose of today's meeting is to provide training to DHHL and its NHHBG program participants to help ensure awareness of NHHBG program requirements and guidance that we have available. It's also to help DHHL determine whether its written policies and procedures that they have in place are sufficient. Pardon me. The topics that we'll be covering today is what is the useful life affordability restriction? We'll get into deeper discussion on the affordability period and how that is determined. What does that mean? And then what is a binding commitment and what is the purpose of that? And then we'll also spend some time on reporting and tracking affordable housing units. So for each of these training sessions, I always start off with some basic information. And so if you've been in attendance with some of the previous sessions, this will be a little bit of a recap or repeat. So the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant requirements are pretty much encompassed within the statute and the regulation. The statute is Title 8 of the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, also what we call NHHBG. And then the regulatory requirements. The regulation is the rules that explain how to implement the law. So the regulation is found at 24 CFR Part 1006. CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations, as well as other federal regulations and requirements that are applicable to the program. And then, as I mentioned today, we will focus on the program requirements surrounding useful life affordability restrictions. And I do want to mention that it is mandated that DHHL and all of its subrecipients, contractors, service providers who help DHHL to implement the NHHBG housing activities, it is mandated that DHHL and all of its program participants comply with the NHHBG statutory and regulatory requirements. Again, some basic information about the Native Hawaiian Housing Block Grant. The purpose of the NHHBG is to provide affordable housing opportunities to low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on the Hawaiian homelands. So when we talk about affordable housing, what do we mean by that? Affordable housing is housing that is developed or assisted with NHHBG funds, and also housing that meets the requirements of NHHBG. And when we say low income, we're talking about generally families that are not exceeding 80% of the median income for the area. And I say generally because I'm going to expand on that a little bit within the next couple of slides. When we talk about Native Hawaiian families, We all know that the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act governs the Hawaiian homelands. And so when we talk about Native Hawaiian families eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands, it is DHHL who determines who is eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands pursuant to the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. And then the housing area is really the Hawaiian homelands for home ownership activities, but it could be on and off Hawaiian homelands when we're using NHHBG to provide rental assistance. And this on and off Hawaiian homelands is pursuant to appropriation language that Congress put forth when they appropriated NHHBG funds to the federal budget in fiscal years 2018 through 2024. One primary objective of Title VIII of NHHBG, also known as the Housing Assistance for Native Hawaiians, is to assist and promote affordable housing activities to develop, maintain, and operate affordable housing in safe and healthy environments for occupancy by low-income Native Hawaiian families. Thus, eligible families meaning families who are eligible to be assisted under Title VIII of NHHBG or NHHBG is generally limited to low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. However, the regulation for the NHHBG program does allow an exception to the low-income requirement, and the exception is limited to assistance for home ownership activities, which can be provided to non-low-income families, meaning families where the household income is greater than 80% of area median income. So again, the exception to the low-income requirement is limited to home ownership activities to non-low-income Native Hawaiian families as approved by HUD to address a need for housing that cannot be reasonably met without that assistance. DHHL must determine and document that housing need. So really the assistance under NHHBG is normally limited to low-income Native Hawaiian families, but if DHHL wanted to assist over-income families, the activity would be limited to home ownership assistance type of activities. And then I have a note here at the bottom of the slide that housing that is assisted pursuant to this section of the regulation shall be considered affordable housing for purposes of NHHBG, and thus these housing units would be subject to useful life affordability restrictions. So again, the affordable housing is housing units that are either developed, built, rehabilitated, financed, purchased using NHHBG funds, or maybe they weren't built or developed using NHHBG funds, but they are being assisted in some way with NHHBG-assisted funds. And if the unit is occupied by low-income families or other families under this exception, the housing is considered affordable housing, and then thus would be subject to the useful life affordability restrictions. Now, when we talk about the low income requirement, this slide is a repeat from the previous training session we did on eligible families and determining income eligibility. But I thought it would be helpful to just review this when we're talking about low-income families participating in the program. This section of the regulation talks about low-income requirement and income targeting. Also, what that really means is when do we determine that the family must be low income in order to receive the assistance under NHHBG. So the regulation says that housing qualifies as affordable housing for purposes of Title VIII of NHHBG, provided that the family occupying the unit is low income at the following times. So if we're looking at doing rental housing, then the family must be low income at the time of initial occupancy of the rental housing unit. When we're dealing with housing for home ownership, then the family must be low income at the time of purchase. Now, we know that sometimes DHHL will enter into a loan contract with the family for the family to assist the family to either purchase the home or construct that home ownership unit. In those instances, the time of purchase means when the loan contract is executed for those transactions. Now, when we're providing assistance for families who already are in an owner-occupied housing unit, then the family must be determined low income at the time the family receives the NHHBG assistance. When we're looking at lease purchase agreement scenarios or rent-to-own type of housing, that's the same thing, then the family must be determined low income for existing housing or housing to be constructed under a lease purchase agreement. The family must be low income at the time the lease purchase agreement is signed. This is just a side note that NHHBG does not require the family to recertify income eligibility when the rental unit converts to homeownership. It's basically just at the time the lease purchase agreement is signed is when the family must be income eligible. When we're using NHHBG to provide emergency assistance to prevent homelessness or foreclosure, then the family must be low income at the time the family receives the NHHBG assistance. Okay, now we're going to start getting more into the discussion about the useful life affordability restrictions. So when we use NHHBG funds on a property, that is considered an investment made for low-income families to reside in that community. The return on that NHHBG investment is the period of time that the unit must remain affordable. That is, that unit must be made available for occupancy by a low-income family. And that period of time is what we refer to as the affordability period or the useful life for that property. A useful life affordability period must be established when NHHBG funds are used to develop a lot, home ownership and rental housing units, or provided to a family for the following types of activities: construction, rehabilitation, acquisition, purchase, down payment, closing costs, financing of the home, and the assistance. And this would apply regardless of whether the assistance is in the form of a grant or a loan. How do we determine the affordability period or the useful life? In accordance with HUD guidelines, DHHL uses a tiered schedule specifying the number of years that the housing unit must remain affordable, dependent on the total amount of NHHBG funds invested in the property. And DHHL includes this information in the Native Hawaiian Housing Plan. So DHHL is required to submit annually a Native Hawaiian Housing Plan to HUD for HUD to determine whether the activities that DHHL intends to use their NHHBG funds for are in compliance with NHHBG. And there is one section within the housing plan where DHHL must define or show how they determine the affordability period or useful life. And so for the current housing plan, which is the 2023 Native Hawaiian Housing Plan, which runs through June 30, this is the affordability period schedule that DHHL has defined. So for NHHBG funds that are invested up to $24,999, that housing unit must remain affordable for a minimum of 5 years. And then so on, depending on the amount of funds invested in the unit, that will determine the accompanying affordability period assigned to that housing unit. As I explained, DHHL will define the affordability period within their housing plan when they submit it to HUD. When HUD reviews DHHL's annual housing plan and determines the housing plan to be in compliance with NHHBG, the affordability period identified in the housing plan is then considered approved by HUD. I just want to explain here that be aware that DHHL has revised the affordability period in the housing plan over the past years. So this is just a reminder to ensure that staff or program participants refer to the current housing plan for when the NHHBG assistance is provided to ensure that the correct affordability period is applied. Because the information could have changed, right, from one year to the next. So just ensure that the current housing plan information is being used. All right. So continuing on with our discussion on the useful life affordability period, useful life affordability restrictions, the affordability period that we just discussed must be enforced with a binding commitment. So here is the regulatory and statutory citation that talks about this. NHHBG-assisted rental and home ownership units, right, the affordable housing, must meet affordability requirements for the remaining useful life of the property without regard to the term of a mortgage or transfer of ownership, right? So if the unit must remain affordable for 20 years, but the family who initially received that assistance, which triggered the affordability period, if they, say, assign their lease to someone else, that affordability period restrictions continue, right? So the affordability restrictions can remain without regard to term of a mortgage or transfer of ownership. We'll talk about that in more detail as we go through the presentation. DHHL, through binding contractual agreements with owners of the housing and other authorized entities, this could be a different scenario if it's not a single family owner occupied unit. So that's why we talk about other authorized entities. So DHHL, through binding contractual agreements, shall ensure long-term compliance with these provisions. The binding agreements shall provide for enforcement by DHHL and HUD, and should also have remedies included within that binding agreement for breach of any of the provisions in that binding agreement. So let's talk a little bit more about the binding commitment. So NHHBG requires that the affordability period be secured through binding commitments that are satisfactory to HUD to ensure that a lot or housing unit will remain affordable for its useful life affordability period. This binding commitment must be a written use restriction or leasehold interest restriction that is placed on the NHHBG assisted property. It must be a covenant that runs with the land. That is, the binding commitment must be recorded against the property. So whatever, these are just examples that I'm using here, some type of use restriction or leasehold interest restriction, but it must be some type of covenant that gets recorded and runs with the land. DHHL does incorporate HUD-approved language into a lease addendum currently for single-family owner-occupied units to that residential homestead lease to serve as the binding commitment. So we talked about, I mentioned earlier that the binding commitment must include remedies for breach of any provisions. So a remedy could be that the binding commitment may contain a schedule that outlines a payback or a recapture amount of a decreasing balance of the full assistance that was provided, or a percentage equity over the affordability period that would be reimbursed to DHHL's NHHBG program if a subsequent occupant of the unit does not meet the NHHBG eligibility requirements. So I'm going to demonstrate that as we get through the presentation. This is an example of that recapture formula to calculate. So as I mentioned earlier, say there's so in this case, there's a retention period for 30 years in this example. And if the lessee who received the NHHBG assistance, which triggered that 30-year affordability period for that housing unit, if that lessee, that low-income Native Hawaiian lessee, if they do not occupy the unit for the full 30 years, and whoever that unit or leasehold interest is assigned to, and if that successor or assignee is not low income, then that's a breach of the binding commitment for this affordability period. Then this is the formula that DHHL has incorporated into the binding agreement to determine what would be that prorated amount that would need to be paid back to DHHL's NHHBG program. So in this example, let's say that the lessee received a $200,000 NHHBG funded loan to construct their home. That results in a retention period or useful life affordability period of 30 years. But say at year 15, the lessee transfers the lease to another Native Hawaiian, but that assignee is non-low income, right? So now that breaches the affordability restriction. So this would be the formula to calculate the amount that needs to be paid back as a remedy for the breach of that affordability restriction. So we would take the 30 years, break it down into months, 360 months minus 15 years, 180 months, and then that divided by the full affordability period, and you come out with a 50% ratio. So 50% of 200,000, which was the amount of NHHBG assistance provided, would result in a $100,000 payback or recapture amount that must be paid back to DHHL's NHHBG program upon the lease transfer. Now, see here at the asterisk, if that subsequent lessee is low income, then there is no recapture required. The affordability period restrictions would continue with no recapture upon the lease transfer. So that's how that would work. I mentioned that DHHL currently incorporates the binding commitment into a lease addendum. And I just wanted to mention just some additional information for awareness that right now, DHHL does have agreements in place with HUD for the FHA 247 mortgage insurance program and another agreement for the HUD Section 184A loan guarantee program. Under those agreements, it specifies that the Hawaiian homestead lease is offered as the security instrument for the mortgage insurance or the loan guarantee that is issued by HUD for those loans to lessees. And the homestead lease must be in a form that is approved by DHHL and HUD. So whenever the homestead lease, the homestead lease is approved by HUD. However, anytime the lease is modified, say with a lease addendum or a lease amendment, the lease addendum or the lease amendment must be reviewed and approved by HUD before it is executed and used as security for the FHA 247 or the HUD 184A loan. So in this case, right, where DHHL is using the lease addendum as the binding commitment for any type of affordability restriction, a NHHBG affordability restriction that may be applicable to the unit or that housing or the leasehold interests, then that lease addendum would need to be submitted to HUD for review to make sure that it's in a form that's approved not only by DHHL but also by HUD. HUD will accept a lease addendum and amendment template for review, provided DHHL does not make substantial edits after HUD approval. So for example, if there are edits made to that already HUD approved lease addendum, just to identify a specific lot or subdivision name, that is acceptable. So in other words, DHHL doesn't have to submit each and every individual lease addendum that would be issued to HUD for approval. If DHHL submits to HUD that lease addendum or lease amendment template that would be used for these situations, once that template is approved by HUD, it can be used as long as you're just changing, right, the identity of the lot or the subdivision name, the lessee and so on. And then to complete this process for submitting lease documents to HUD for review, please submit all lease documents to myself, Claudine Allen, at the HUD office in Honolulu to facilitate the HUD review process for FHA 247 and HUD 184A program purposes. So I just thought that would be helpful additional information just to kind of close the loop on this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about successorship. So I did explain that some type of covenant, right, that gets recorded and runs with the land must be used as the binding commitment. So let's use the residential lot. It could be an agricultural lot as well, but let's use the homestead lease documents as the example. And if that is the instrument being used as the binding commitment, and we talked about how lessees could change during the affordability period. And so we all know, right, that there is successorship allowed under the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. HUD has determined that DHHL may make the determination that the affordability period for the NHHBG-assisted lot or housing unit may end upon the lessee's death. However, this determination shall not be made for the purposes to circumvent NHHBG affordability restrictions. If DHHL does not terminate the affordability period upon a lessee's death, and the successor is not low income, then the remedy for that breach, right, in the affordability restriction is that a prorated portion or the full amount, that either one, of the NHHBG assistance must be reimbursed to DHHL's NHHBG program. So it would just be dependent on the language that is included within that lease document to explain the affordability restriction placed on that lot or housing unit. And I say that because DHHL has taken different positions on this over the years. There may be some leases out there that say the affordability period will terminate upon a lessee's death. And there are other lease documents that do not have that language. And so that's why I strongly encourage whenever this needs to be looked into to see what is the circumstance for that particular lease or leasehold interest when it comes to the affordability period and enforcing that affordability period restriction, please refer to the lease document with the NHHBG affordability restriction language. So continuing on with that discussion about successorship. If there is no successor to a deceased lessee, and the lease then resumes its status as unleased Hawaiian homelands, right? The leasehold tract goes back to DHHL. DHHL must continue to enforce the affordability restriction placed on that lot or unit when issuing a new homestead lease to a new lessee. If the NHHBG assistance is invested in infrastructure only, there is no NHHBG funds put into the development of the vertical unit. So the NHHBG assistance is for the infrastructure for the lot only. Then the unit must still be occupied by a low-income family for the duration of the affordability period placed on that lot. So again, in this case where the assistance is only in the lot and not the unit, if the property transfers to an over-income family before the affordability period ends, then the remedy is that DHHL is responsible for repaying a portion of the NHHBG assistance that was invested in that lot to DHHL's NHHBG program. Okay. I wanted to mention something about this affordability proration. DHHL must make a concerted effort to accurately estimate how many NHHBG affordable units will result when planning a multi-unit housing project. And I'm talking about, both. It could be a single family dwelling residential subdivision, or it could be a multi-floor building with rental apartments within the building. So in either case, DHHL must make a concerted effort to accurately estimate how many NHHBG affordable units will result once that project is built. If NHHBG is used to pay 50% of the project cost, then at least, right, at minimum, 50% of the housing units must be occupied by low-income families during the affordability period assigned to that project or housing unit. It is not acceptable to purposely front-load project costs with NHHBG funds and then just pay it back later. So again, this is more on the development side of DHHL's operation when planning out these projects. And I'm going to segue into the section on reporting and tracking. DHHL must identify and track each affordable lot or housing unit, the affordability period. These are the types of things that DHHL should include in their reporting and tracking mechanisms, right? First, they have to identify each affordable lot and or unit. And within their tracking and reporting system, make sure that they keep track of the start and end date of the affordability period, the amount of NHHBG assistance that was invested in the lot and or unit. And DHHL must keep records of all use restrictions that are applicable to the lot and or housing unit. So there could be other funding used in combination with NHHBG funds when developing a project. So there could be additional use or affordability restrictions that are triggered by other funding sources, which may be imposed, provided that DHHL ensures compliance with the NHHBG useful life affordability period and restrictions, right? So you could have different types of use and affordability restrictions applicable to the project or unit. So DHHL must ensure to keep track of all of those. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, any subsequent transfer of the property is subject to any remaining affordability period under a recorded binding commitment. So DHHL must also track any transfer in the leasehold interest and determine whether the affordability restriction or binding commitment is breached. And of course, if there is a breach, then DHHL must calculate and collect the appropriate amount of repayment to DHHL's NHHBG program. Continuing on with the reporting and tracking, a current record must be maintained and be available for review. So a current record of the reporting and tracking of these units must be maintained and be available for review. So for example, if HUD is going to be doing a monitoring review of DHHL, then DHHL would need to be able to make that information available to HUD. DHHL should have adequate procedures in place for collecting this information and reporting this information if it's being collected and reported across different divisions within DHHL's establishment. I think I should probably go back here and just mention something, because I think it was in the first training session we did on the NHHBG overview. I did an overview of what the NHHBG program is, and I described a list of all of the different program requirements that are applicable to the NHHBG program. And during that training session, I just gave a very brief description of all of the different program requirements. And I recall that when I briefly talked about this useful life affordability restriction, I believe at that time I mentioned that the useful life affordability restriction applies to affordable housing units as well as model activities. So what I want to do is retract part of what I said then and give some clarification, since we're specifically talking about the useful life affordability restrictions in this training session, and confirm, yes, for sure, the useful life affordability restrictions are applicable to affordable housing units assisted with NHHBG. But once we talk about the NHHBG model activities, which is a different category of eligible activity that NHHBG funds can be used for, one example of a model activity would be a community center. For example, the Papakolea Community Center located on Homestead in Papakolea. There was a project where NHHBG funds were requested to be used in combination with other funding sources to make improvements to that facility. And then that facility would be used part of the time to hold homebuyer education classes. And so that is an eligible example of a model activity. So in the earlier training session, I mentioned that model activities would also be subject to useful life affordability restrictions. So what I want to correct on that statement, what I need to correct in that statement is that it's not a statutory or regulatory requirement to place useful life and affordability restrictions on those types of model activities. But within the request for HUD approval to use NHHBG funds for that model activity, HUD could require that DHHL make that model activity available for that continued affordable housing purpose for a certain period of time. So I hope that helps to explain that a little bit better. So for model activities, it's not necessarily a statutory or regulatory requirement, but within that request for HUD approval to use NHHBG funds for that model activity, HUD could include a requirement as a condition of the approval that that model activity will be available for affordable housing residents or purposes of affordable housing for a set period of time. Okay, thank you for allowing me to explain that. Okay, let's continue. So this is my summary slide because this represents the end of my presentation. So let me just summarize some of the points that we discussed in today's presentation. NHHBG-assisted lots and units must benefit low-income Native Hawaiian families who are eligible to reside on Hawaiian homelands. DHHL must make a concerted effort to accurately estimate the correct proportion of NHHBG units in the development of multi-unit projects. And again, this is more in the development part of doing the project, making sure that funds are used as appropriately as possible, so you're not front-loading and paying for upfront project costs with NHHBG, and then later on thinking that DHHL can just reimburse the NHHBG program if the project doesn't result in the correct number of affordable housing units. We want to try and have DHHL plan that out as carefully as possible. Another point to summarize, lots and units that are assisted with NHHBG funds for construction, purchase, rehabilitation, financing, and again, regardless of whether the assistance is in the form of a grant or a loan, then those lots and units must be made available for low-income families for that specified affordability period. A binding commitment must be used to enforce the affordability period and restriction to ensure long-term compliance, and that it provides remedies for breach of that commitment. And then finally, DHHL must keep records to track and monitor each NHHBG assisted lot or unit with affordability restrictions. This is a link to the HUD website for our NHHBG program guidance documents. And we do have a program guidance in place to give more detailed information about the NHHBG requirements with regard to useful life and binding commitments for the NHHBG program. And so this is where you can find at this link is where you can find the NHHBG program guidance 2013-03. Okay. Lehua, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm ready to take questions.
So I just